In late 2002, it was reported that a government-appointed official in Senegal was caught selling $18 million worth of drugs to customers in Europe. These drugs were not anything illicit, right? They weren't inherently illegal. It wasn't heroin or cocaine or anything like that. It was instead something that we've talked about earlier in this course. And that's Combivir. For those of us that don't remember, Combivir is an antiretroviral. It's a drug that was designed to help treat HIV and AIDS. So why was this drug that presumably, and not just presumably, I'll go ahead and tell you that it was available in Europe, why was it being shipped from Africa to Europe? And why did somebody get in trouble for doing so? The reason for this, or the answer to both of these questions, is because they were taking advantage of a difference in price. In Europe, a single pill of Combivir is sold for, or was sold for at the time, $12.50 per pill, all right, as we discussed in our chapter on monopoly. All right, in Africa, however, the drug was sold much lower to actual cost, which is 50 cents. All right, so the government official had been taking this drug that had been provided or sold at a much lower cost, at a price much closer to the actual manufacturing cost, and was selling it back in the European market, right, where you'd sell for less than $12.50 per pill and still make a tiny little profit. This is an example of price discrimination, right? Well, let me clarify that. The different prices, right? $12.50 in Europe and 50 cents in Africa. This is an example of price discrimination. Price discrimination is when a firm sells the same good for different prices to different consumers. So why do firms do this? Why do they practice price discrimination? Short answer, well, really the answer, is that it increases their profits, right? They can further maximize their profits if firms can price discriminate. Let's look at an example of this. We will use a facsimile of the market in Africa and Europe for Combivir to illustrate. now that we have these up here, let's talk a little bit about these curves before we look at the profits. So you can see that we do have different graphs, we have different demand curves, and this makes sense. The demand for something like Convivir in Europe is very likely to be more inelastic than it is in Africa. Right? There are several things that contribute to this, right? Our main determinant of elasticity of demand is the number of substitutes. Well, for both of these, the number of substitutes is very small, right? There are not a lot of substitutes, so you'd expect demand to be inelastic. All right, but if we look at a different determinant of elasticity of demand that's going to differ between these two, right? Portion of the budget, we can see where that difference lies, right? In Europe, $12.50 per pill, while very high, is not really comparable to 50 cents per pill in Africa, right? So in Africa, I think we'll get to the statistic in a little bit, but many people, right, in Africa lived on less than $1 a day, right? So 50 cents per pill, a pill that has to be taken every day, is going to eat in the budget. It's going to be a very large portion of someone's budget, right? So that's going to make their demand for something like this more elastic than it would for Europeans, where $12.50 is not as large a portion of the budget for them. Right, however, we can assume that the marginal cost, and we're going to assume marginal cost equals average total cost for simplicity's sake. We can assume that those are equal or at least pretty much the same, right? It's not going to cost you that much more to sell the good in Europe than it is in Africa. There are going to be some, presumably some transportation costs, some shipping costs, unless they have a factory there. Regardless, we're going to assume that marginal cost is equal for both markets. All right, so in order to find the profit, we would need to look where a marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Right, so the area, right, our profit is this rectangle for Europe and this rectangle for Africa, right? So price minus average total cost times quantity. Right? If the firm was to set a single price for the entire market, they would likely set a price somewhere between the price charged in Europe and the price charged in Africa, right? They're not going to charge more than the price in Europe because that's going to go over their profit maximizing price, right? Their profit maximizing quantity. So they wouldn't want to go above that, and they wouldn't want to go below that 50 cents in Africa, or they would have already priced as such. Right, so let's say that they set the world price here. All right, so this is getting a little cluttered, but if we look at it, right, that would give us profits, right? Our profit would be calculated the same way, price minus average total cost times quantity. And so this, and I'm just gonna, we're almost done with this. So this would now be the profit in, I guess technically, this would be the profit in Europe. And that would be the profit in Africa. Right? Now, of course, depending on how we draw that, actually really, in most cases, right, this profit level is going to be lower than what we were looking at previously. Right? With a single price, firm is going to have a lower profit. Right? It's not going to have as large of a profit as if, or not as if, but when they price discriminate. All right, so now we're going to look at the principles of price discrimination. All right, so our first principle is that if the demand curves are different, then it's going to be more profitable to set different prices in different markets. All right, as we saw in that example, we did have different markets, right? And so there was price discrimination. The second principle is that in order to maximize profit, the firm should set the higher price in the market with more inelastic demand. And this makes sense, right? If demand is inelastic, it means that consumers are less sensitive to changes in price. So if you increase the cost, if you increase the price, then you're not going to see as much of a drop off in quantity, right? Whereas in the market with the more elastic demand, we would see a larger change in quantity relative to a change in price. And this is what we saw, right? It's a very safe assumption that demand for Combivir in Europe is much more inelastic than it is in Africa. And so we saw the higher price being set in Africa. Our third and final principle of price discrimination is that arbitrage makes it difficult for a firm to price discriminate. All right, so what is arbitrage? Well, we've already seen an example of it. arbitrage is buying low in one market and selling high in another, right? So when our Senegalese official got this Combavir for 50 cents in Africa, they were buying low in the African market and then smuggling the drug into Europe to sell for a higher price, thereby profiting off of the discrepancy of price in the two arenas, or the two markets, probably be a more accurate phrase. All right, one thing that I want to stress is that arbitrage in and of itself is not illegal. Although one of the big examples of arbitrage, which is smuggling, in most cases is illegal, and it definitely was in this case, right? This government official was not legally allowed to buy this drug in the African market and sell it in the European market. Right? But again, all right, arbitrage makes price discrimination difficult because if arbitrage can occur, then that price is going to move closer towards the lower price, right? If you can buy, African Combavir for less than $12.50 easily, then you're less likely to buy the European Combavir for $12.50 if you can get it at a cheaper price. So obviously, if a firm wants to practice price discrimination, they are going to have to figure out a way to avoid arbitrage, right? To prevent arbitrage. There's no hard and fast rule of how to do it, or arbitrage would kind of cease to exist for these kinds of things. But the companies that have a vested interest in preventing arbitrage have come up with some inventive ways. So these are just some examples just to kind of further illustrate kind of arbitrage and how we might prevent it. You don't necessarily need to know these specifics. All right, as such, I'm not going to write a whole lot of stuff on the board. All right, so let's start with what we were looking at originally, Combavir. All right, so how did the firm that makes Combavir, GlaxoSmithKline, how did they catch this government-appointed official, right? How did they find out that he was selling African Combavir in a European market? Well, in order to help prevent arbitrage, or at least be able to identify when it's happening, Combavir sells red pills in Africa, right? So all the Combavir destined for the African market is colored red. And all of the Combavir that is destined for the European market is white. So if someone finds it, one of GlaxoSmithKline's investigators finds red Combavir in Europe, they know that one of their distributors or someone somewhere along the line is taking that drug from Africa and shipping it back up to Europe. All right, then they'll go through, investigation and call Interpol or whoever to sort that out. All right, so that is how they handle this. All right, another example, which I quite like, a company called Rome and Haas is a manufacturer of plastics. One of the plastics that they produce is called methyl methacrylate. Knowing the name isn't necessarily important, but what is important is that methyl methacrylate has two kind of big uses. Right? One, it's used in a lot of industrial applications. And it's also used in dentistry, right? Or really specifically making dentures. Right? In the industrial applications, it has many substitutes, so it has elastic demand. Right? However, in the dental applications, it has very few, right, or fewer substitutes, so it has more inelastic demand. So Rome and Haas wants to take advantage of this. They want to practice price discrimination, so they're going to set the higher price in the market that has the more inelastic demand, which is the market for the dental applications. And they did set very different prices, right? The industrial grade was sold at 85 cents per pound, the dental at $22 per pound. Now I say industrial grade, but really these were exactly the same, right? They were the same product, right? Any differences were minor and they could have been used interchangeably, right? So some enterprising individuals, instead of buying the $22 per pound dental methyl methacrylate, would buy the 85 cents per pound. So while trying to determine how to prevent arbitrage, to prevent people from doing this, someone suggested that they mix arsenic with the industrial grade plastic. Right? This would not compromise the industrial grade plastic for what it was actually intended for, but it would prevent people from using it in dental applications because, of course, arsenic is extremely poisonous. Right? They didn't actually do this. Right? They didn't actually mix poison in there. Right? However, what they did instead was simply start the rumor that they were mixing arsenic in the industrial grade plastic. All right, so that way people would be hesitant and much less likely to take that industrial grade and use it for the dental applications out of fear that they would poison their customers. Right, while Rome and Haas did not poison their product, someone else does. And they do so at the behest of the US government. Right, ethanol fuel is subsidized by the US government. And regular alcohol, consumable, drinkable alcohol, is taxed. Right, so in order to prevent people from converting ethanol fuel that's subsidized into consumable alcohol, the US government requires that ethanol fuel be poisoned in order to prevent this. Now, not all products are really capable of these types of things, right? It's not possible to prevent arbitrage in all settings. Things like services, you can't really prevent arbitrage, and therefore you can't really do a whole lot of price discrimination in most cases. But these were some examples of ways to prevent arbitrage, right, and to allow a firm to continue practicing price discrimination. All right, in the next video, we're going to be looking at different types of price discrimination and probably some other stuff. We'll see how far we get in it. All right, I'll see you in the next video.